He woke up after the accident and heard his wife talking about the inheritance, certain that he would never recover. She wanted him dead, but didn't realize he was hearing every word. Subscribe to the channel, and in the comments write, where are you watching this video from? The night was dark and heavy, the sky covered in thick, low-hanging clouds that suffocated the city beneath them. The streets shimmered under the orange glow of streetlights, reflecting off the wet asphalt like polished obsidian. The rhythmic hum of tires against the road filled the air as Jerome Blake maneuvered his sleek, charcoal-black Aston Martin through the nearly deserted highway. A long day behind him, Jerome exhaled, rolling his neck to ease the tension that had settled into his shoulders. The business meeting had stretched far longer than he anticipated, filled with negotiations, legal paperwork, and last-minute contract amendments. He had been looking forward to getting home, slipping into something comfortable and unwinding with a glass of bourbon in his dimly lit study. His home, his empire, awaited him. The sprawling modern estate, the polished marble floors, the quiet hum of climate control systems keeping everything in perfect balance. His wife, Elizabeth, was likely already asleep, or at least pretending to be. Their marriage had become a transaction, a careful performance of pleasantries and restrained distance. Still, as the city lights faded into the rearview mirror and the open stretch of highway lay ahead, Jerome allowed himself to relax. He reached toward the console, fingers brushing over the dial to turn on some music. Maybe something slow, something to soothe his restless mind. That was when it happened. A bright flash of headlights in the opposite lane, too close, too fast. A massive 18-wheeler, its bulk towering over the highway, swerved out of control, veering directly into his lane. Jerome's instincts kicked in, his heart slamming against his ribcage as he yanked the steering wheel, trying to avoid the collision. The world tilted. The tires screeched, rubber burning against the pavement. A deafening impact sent his car spinning like a toy caught in the hands of an unseen force. The force of the crash sent him hurtling sideways, metal twisting, glass exploding into 1,000 tiny shards. His body slammed against the seatbelt, the tension digging into his ribs as his car flipped, once, twice, a third time, before landing in a crumpled heap on the roadside. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the distant sound of sirens, the acrid scent of gasoline in the air, and the faint taste of blood on his tongue. Jerome's vision blurred, his breath ragged, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven movements. Somewhere in the distance, voices called out. Then, darkness. When Jerome drifted into consciousness again, it was fleeting, like trying to grasp smoke with bare hands. There were bright, sterile lights overhead, shifting shadows moving across his vision. The smell of antiseptic, the beeping of machines in a steady, rhythmic pattern. A hospital. His body felt heavy, as if submerged under water. Every attempt to move was met with resistance, as though his limbs were no longer his own. Somewhere nearby, he heard muffled voices, distorted as though traveling through a tunnel. Severe trauma, internal bleeding, critical condition. Coma. That word settled in his brain like a stone sinking into deep water. Coma. He wasn't awake, he wasn't asleep. He was trapped somewhere in between. Time passed in strange, fractured moments. Jerome wasn't sure if hours, days, or weeks had gone by. He drifted in and out, catching snippets of conversation, feeling vague touches of hands adjusting tubes, hearing the distant echo of a heartbeat monitor. Then, one day, something pulled him closer to the surface of reality. A voice. At first, it was indistinct, blending with the other sounds in the hospital. But then it became clearer, more familiar. Elizabeth, his wife. His mind, though sluggish, latched onto the familiarity. She was speaking, her voice low but firm, the kind of tone she used when discussing serious matters. But something was off. "Doctor, is there really no way to be sure?" A pause, then a deeper voice, one of the physicians probably. "We have to wait and see. The damage was severe, but there's still brain activity. We can't predict when or if he will wake up." A long silence. Then Elizabeth's voice again. "How long do we have to wait?" Another silence, one that felt loaded with meaning. "He could wake up next week or next year. There's no way to say for certain." Jerome wanted to move, wanted to open his eyes, to let them know he was still here. But his body refused to listen. Then came the words that froze his blood in his veins. I don't want to see him like this, suffering. He wouldn't want this, doctor. He always said he didn't want to be kept alive artificially if there was no hope. I don't want to see him like this, suffering. He wouldn't want this, doctor. He always said he didn't want to be kept alive artificially if there was no hope." The doctor hesitated. "We can't make that decision lightly, Mrs. Blake. His mother has also expressed strong opposition to terminating life support." His mother. She was fighting for him. Elizabeth's voice was softer now, almost persuasive. "She just doesn't understand that this isn't living. He was so full of life. He wouldn't want to be trapped in this state indefinitely. Please, doctor, we need to talk about options." A cold dread settled into Jerome's unmoving body. Elizabeth wanted him dead. The days blurred after that. Jerome, unable to speak, unable to move, could do nothing but listen. Elizabeth played the role of a grieving wife perfectly. She spoke in hushed, trembling tones whenever nurses were around, made solemn statements about how hard this was for her. But when she thought she was alone, her voice was calm, measured, almost impatient. "How long are they going to drag this out? We both know he's never coming back. His mother is being difficult." And then, one night, he heard her speaking in hushed tones over the phone. "Yes, I've already spoken to them. No, I haven't touched the accounts yet. I need it to look natural." A pause. "The moment they take him off the machines, the estate will be settled. I'll transfer the assets immediately." Jerome lay there, trapped in his own body, screaming inside. Elizabeth wasn't just waiting for him to die. She was making sure of it. Jerome lay motionless, his body a prisoner within itself, yet his mind was sharpening with each passing day. He no longer drifted in the chaotic haze of unconsciousness. He was aware. Aware of the hum of machines, the rhythmic beeping of monitors that measured his existence in mechanical pulses. Aware of the sterile scent of antiseptic that filled the air, of the occasional touch of a gloved hand adjusting tubes and wires that tethered him to life. And most of all, he was aware of her, Elizabeth. Her voice, once warm and familiar, now sent a chill through him. It was not the voice of a loving wife grieving beside her injured husband. It was calculating, restrained. There was no desperation in her words, no trace of sorrow or hope. Only a quiet, insistent certainty that his time was running out. She spoke in carefully measured tones whenever doctors and nurses were present. She sighed at all the right moments, her voice catching in her throat as she whispered about how difficult it was to see him like this. She wrung her hands, asked about his prognosis in a voice laced with feigned fragility. But Jerome had begun to notice something else. The moments when she thought no one was listening. The times she lingered in his hospital room after visiting hours, alone with him, believing him to be nothing more than an unresponsive shell. That was when she dropped the act. That was when he heard the truth. One evening, just as the fluorescent lights dimmed and the quiet of the night shift settled over the hospital, Elizabeth stood beside his bed, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the crisp white sheets. Her sigh was soft, almost bored. "I don't know why they keep prolonging this," she murmured. "It's cruel, really." She wasn't speaking to him. She was speaking about him, as if he were already gone, just a lingering inconvenience. She reached out and lightly touched his arm, a gesture so devoid of warmth that it sent a ripple of silent rage through him. "This isn't what you would have wanted, right?" she continued, "being kept alive by machines, stuck in this limbo. It's not fair to either of us." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "But don't worry, love. It won't be much longer." Jerome's heart, though steady under the watchful sensors, thundered inside his chest. He wanted to recoil from her touch, to rip away the tubes and monitors and tell her that he knew, that he had heard everything. But his body betrayed him. His limbs remained limp, his lips silent. He was trapped, and she was waiting. The next morning, Elizabeth met with an attorney in a private hospital office. Jerome didn't see it, but he knew. She had been making arrangements. She was careful, methodical, making sure that everything appeared natural. The hospital administrators were hesitant. The doctors weren't ready to give up, and his mother, bless her stubborn soul, was fighting for him with everything she had. But Elizabeth knew how to play the role of the grieving wife, knew how to persuade, and so she applied pressure. That same evening, she spoke to the doctors again, her voice measured but insistent. "I just want to respect his wishes," she said softly. "He always said he wouldn't want to be kept like this." The lead physician, an older man with a kind but weary face, sighed. "Mrs. Blake, I understand your concerns, but your husband is still exhibiting brain activity. We can't make assumptions about his recovery yet." Elizabeth lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting the pearl bracelet on her wrist. She had perfected the balance between sorrow and resignation. "But how long do we keep pretending there's hope?" she whispered. "Doctor, I see him every day like this. It's agony. For him. For me." The doctor shifted in his seat. "His mother has also expressed strong wishes to continue treatment. She believes he will recover." Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but she quickly softened her expression, nodding slowly, as if in understanding. "She's in denial," she said gently. "She doesn't want to accept what's happening, but I have to be realistic. I have to be strong for him." She let out a slow, deliberate breath. "Doctor, I want to discuss end-of-life options." Jerome wanted to scream. He felt the weight of her words settle over him like a death shroud. She wasn't just hoping he wouldn't wake up. She was making sure he never did. Over the next few days, her visits became more infrequent. She was no longer spending long hours sitting by his side, holding his hand for the benefit of hospital staff. Instead, she was occupied elsewhere, meeting with financial advisors, preparing. One afternoon, a hushed phone conversation reached his ears. "I've spoken to them. No, nothing's finalized yet. They need my signature, but it's just a matter of time." A pause, a slow exhale. "The estate is worth more than I thought. I just need this to be over." Jerome felt something inside him shift. For weeks, he had been trapped in helpless silence, his mind screaming against his unresponsive body. He had drifted in and out of darkness, trying to grasp onto the world beyond his motionless prison. But now, something changed. A fire burned in his chest, slow and smoldering, growing stronger with each breath, each passing hour. He wasn't done. He would not let her win. She thought she had control. She thought he was already gone. But she was wrong. Because deep in the quiet of his mind, Jerome was waking up. Time had lost meaning for Jerome. Days and nights blended into an endless, formless haze where moments of consciousness flickered like distant stars in the night sky. He was drifting, sometimes caught in the undertow of unconsciousness, other times hovering just beneath the surface of awareness, able to hear but unable to respond. But now, something was different. The darkness that had held him in its grip for so long was beginning to crack. A thin sliver of light, faint at first, was breaking through, and with it came the slow return of sensation. It was nothing more than a tingling at first, a faint awareness of his own body, as though he were trapped within it, buried beneath layers of unyielding stone. Then there was sound. Muted, as if he were listening through water, but distinct nonetheless. The rhythmic beeping of machines, the low murmur of voices beyond his room, the occasional shuffling of footsteps against sterile floors. And then, closer, the voice he had come to recognize with a terrible, sinking certainty. Elizabeth. She was speaking again, not with the measured grief she displayed in front of the doctors, but with that quiet, indifferent finality that he had come to dread. "I don't want to drag this out any longer," she was saying. "It's cruel, really. The doctors just don't want to tell me what we both already know." There was a pause, the rustling of fabric as she shifted. "They'll come around soon enough, and then this will all be over." Jerome willed his body to move, even the smallest twitch, the slightest shift of a finger. But it was like trying to lift an impossible weight, every nerve still trapped in the depths of paralysis. He wanted to scream. It was a primal, desperate thing clawing at his insides, the need to shatter the illusion she had created, to let the world know that he was still here. But his body remained motionless, his breath steady under the machines that did the work for him. Then, as if the universe had heard his silent plea, something changed. There was a shift, a whisper of movement. His index finger, barely noticeable, trembled against the sheet beneath it. It was the smallest of gestures, but to him, it was everything. A crack in the dam, a sign that his body was no longer a prison from which he could never escape. The effort drained him, sending him spiraling back into exhaustion, but the seed of hope had been planted. He was not powerless. He was not lost. He was fighting back. The next time he surfaced, the room was quiet. Elizabeth was gone, but he was not alone. A presence hovered near his bedside, light and careful. A scent, subtle, clean, a hint of lavender. There was warmth, the sensation of soft fingers brushing against his wrist. Amara. She had been there before, he realized. In the quiet hours when no one else was watching, she had tended to him, speaking to him in hushed tones, as if she somehow knew he could hear her. A cool, damp cloth pressed against his lips, a gentle effort to moisten them. He focused, concentrating on the sensation, the way his mouth reacted, the way his body tried, wanted to respond. And then it happened. His lips parted, the smallest motion, barely perceptible. The cloth shifted as he attempted to draw in the moisture, an instinctual response that felt like a victory. Amara stilled. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then the faintest intake of breath. "You're awake," she whispered, so soft he might have imagined it. There was no immediate rush for the doctors, no alarm sounded. Instead, she remained there, her fingers pressing lightly against his hand. "Do it again," she urged gently. "If you can hear me, Do it again." It took every ounce of strength he had, but he forced the movement. His fingers tightened, the smallest fraction of a grip barely there, but real. A breathless, almost disbelieving sound escaped her, something between a laugh and a gasp. "I knew it," she murmured. Jerome felt the weight of exhaustion pull at him again, dragging him back under, but this time he knew he was coming back. When he woke again, he could feel more. The weight of his body against the bed, the slight ache in his muscles from disuse. It was still a prison, but now he could feel its edges, could sense the walls beginning to weaken. Amara was there. She had been coming more often, he realized. Every visit was careful, filled with quiet encouragement, her presence a stark contrast to Elizabeth's chilling detachment. She tested his movements, small, incremental victories, the twitch of a toe, the slightest flex of his fingers. She celebrated them all, whispered words of reassurance, never doubting, never dismissing the signs that he was returning. She never told Elizabeth, and Jerome was grateful for that. Time moved differently now. He was improving, but slowly, each step forward met with fatigue that threatened to pull him back under. But he wasn't giving up. Not now. Elizabeth had no idea. She still spoke as if his fate was decided, still whispered in low, callous tones about how much longer she had to wait. She didn't see the way Amara watched him now, how her eyes held something knowing when she checked his vitals, how she lingered just a moment longer after every small success. The night before the doctors planned to reassess his condition, Elizabeth stood beside his bed once more. Her voice was low, almost soothing in its false tenderness. "It'll be soon now," she said. "I've signed the papers. You'll be free of all this soon." Jerome lay still, the anger burning beneath his skin, but he forced himself to wait. When she left, Amara came. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to find the words. Then she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "They told me they'll call your wife in the morning," she said, "to tell her you're gone." She hesitated, then, for the first time, smiled. "But I'll be calling the doctor instead." Jerome closed his eyes, exhaustion weighing on him, but this time it wasn't the darkness of before. This time it was relief. Because tomorrow the world would know, and Elizabeth would lose everything. Jerome drifted in and out of sleep, caught between exhaustion and a quiet, simmering anticipation. The weight of his body against the hospital bed was no longer something distant and foreign. He could feel himself again, weak but present. The air was no longer a formless haze of sterility. He could distinguish the scent of fresh linen, the faint trace of antiseptic that clung to everything. The rhythmic beeping of the machines, once an abstract sound in the void, was now a measured reminder that he was alive, still here, still fighting. And he wasn't fighting alone. Amara had been coming more often. He could tell by the way she moved around him, the warmth of her hand against his skin when she checked his pulse, the soft way she whispered encouragement whenever she thought no one else could hear. She never rushed, never assumed that his silence meant absence. She spoke to him as if he were already awake, already there, waiting just beneath the surface. She believed in him. It was a strange thing, realizing how much her presence mattered. She was not family, not a friend from his past. She was simply a nurse, a woman who had no reason to care beyond the professional duty of her job. And yet, there was something in her voice, in the careful way she touched his hand, in the patience with which she watched for the smallest signs of progress that told him she saw more than the doctors did, more than Elizabeth ever had. He was coming back, and she knew it. It started with his fingers. The first deliberate twitch had taken every ounce of effort he had, leaving him drained for hours after. But he had done it. And once he had moved his fingers, once he had proven to himself that he could, there was no stopping. The next time Amara touched his wrist, he focused all his energy, willing his fingers to respond. He felt them move, barely perceptible, but real. A fraction of a second later, she inhaled sharply. "Jerome," she whispered, her voice full of something he hadn't heard in so long, hope. She pressed her fingertips lightly against his hand. "If you can hear me, try again." It was agony, dragging his body from the depths of stillness, but he did it. He willed his fingers to move, to tighten around hers, even if it was the weakest grip he had ever mustered. Amara exhaled in a rush, a soft laugh escaping her. It was the kind of sound that carried warmth, a sound that made him want to hold on just a little longer. "You're here," she whispered, her fingers tightening in return. He was. The days blurred into one another, each bringing small victories. Amara kept her promise, saying nothing to Elizabeth, nothing to the doctors who had already written him off. She was careful, checking on him in the quiet moments of her shifts, speaking to him in hushed tones, testing his responses in ways that no one else noticed. She pressed a cool cloth to his lips, and he tried again and again to react. At first, it was nothing more than a slight parting of his mouth, but with time, he was able to control it, to take in the moisture instead of merely letting it rest against his skin. She moved his limbs for him, stretching his muscles so they wouldn't deteriorate further. And little by little, his body began to respond. A twitch in his foot, a flex of his wrist, the slow, agonizing effort of trying to open his eyes. Elizabeth never noticed. She had stopped visiting so often, leaving her parting words in the air as if they were nothing more than obligatory farewells. She didn't linger at his bedside, didn't study his face for signs of change. She had already decided that he was gone, that he was nothing more than a breathing corpse waiting for permission to fade completely. But Amara watched, Amara saw. And one evening, just as she was adjusting his sheets, she whispered something that made his pulse spike. "I think you'll be able to open your eyes soon." It had never felt so impossible. His eyelids felt heavier than steel, his body resisting him at every turn. But she was right. The pressure was there, the feeling of something just beyond reach, the smallest hint of control waiting to be grasped. She let her fingers rest lightly on his temple, her thumb brushing his forehead in a soothing motion. "You don't have to rush," she murmured, "but you're getting stronger. I can see it." Jerome wanted to tell her she was right, that he could feel it too, but all he could do was hold on to the warmth of her touch and let it anchor him in place. The next day, he tried again and again, until, after what felt like an eternity of effort, he felt something shift. The world was dim, blurred beyond recognition. The fluorescent lights overhead were muted, too bright for his unprepared eyes, but he could see. Not much, not clearly, but enough. A figure was beside him, and he knew, without needing to confirm, that it was her, Amara. Her breath caught, her body stilling as she realized what had happened. "Jerome," she whispered, leaning closer. He tried to move his lips, to form even the barest semblance of sound, but his body wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He blinked. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes shining with something close to disbelief. "You're awake." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an assumption. It was truth. She didn't call for the doctors. She didn't run to alert anyone else. Instead, she took his hand, her fingers wrapping around his as she smiled, her eyes filled with quiet triumph. "You did it," she whispered. "I knew you would." Jerome squeezed her fingers as tightly as he could, letting the weight of his victory settle between them. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was coming back. And soon, Elizabeth would learn the truth. Jerome's world was still small, his body weak, his movements sluggish, but now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he had control. His fingers could grasp, his lips could part, his eyes could open to the blurred, blinding brightness of the hospital room. The journey back into himself was slow and painful, but it was real. He was no longer a silent spectator in his own life. Amara had been by his side through it all. She had witnessed every struggle, every minor victory, and she alone had kept his secret. While the doctors moved past his room, speaking of him in distant, clinical terms, while Elizabeth barely spared him a glance between her quiet meetings and whispered phone calls, Amara had seen him. She had been the only one who truly believed he was still there, and now she was the only one who knew the truth. She had not called the doctors when he first opened his eyes. She had not alerted Elizabeth when he moved his hand with deliberate effort. Instead, she had knelt beside him, her fingers warm against his, and told him what she was going to do. She was going to save him. The plan had come together in hushed conversations, whispered words in the dead of night, when the hallways were quiet and no one was watching. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only way. Elizabeth had already decided he was dead. She was waiting for the final step, for the doctor's quiet confirmation, for the paperwork to be signed, for his body to be turned over to her so she could proceed with the funeral and the inheritance. She had been preparing for it, her visits growing shorter, her voice losing the careful edge of mourning that she once maintained. She had given up on him long ago, and so Jerome decided to let her believe she had won. On a quiet morning, just before sunrise, the hospital room was still. The machines continued their steady rhythm, the beeping of the heart monitor a familiar, ceaseless sound. Amara stood beside his bed, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the IV, her fingers moving with precision as she worked. "They'll be calling your wife soon," she murmured, "to tell her you're gone." Jerome lay still, his breathing shallow, his eyes barely open as he focused on her voice. He didn't need to reply. She already knew he understood. "I'll call the doctor instead," she continued. "I've already spoken to him. He trusts me." Jerome had seen the kindness in his physician's eyes, the quiet skepticism whenever Elizabeth had pressed too hard about his condition. The man had not been fully convinced of his hopelessness, and Amara had played on that doubt, had told him of the small movements, the faint responses. He had listened. He had believed her. Now he was part of the plan. Amara glanced at the clock, her pulse quickening. The timing had to be perfect. If Elizabeth arrived too soon, if she questioned too much, everything would fall apart. But the woman was too confident, too sure of herself. She would not rush. She would accept the news with well-practiced grief, shed a few tears, and then go home to finalize her new life. Amara turned back to Jerome, her eyes softening as she reached for his hand. "You're going to be free of her?" she whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." And then she left. Time moved strangely after that. Jerome let his mind drift, keeping his body as still as possible, listening to the subtle movements outside his room, the muffled voices of nurses and doctors preparing for the moment. An hour passed, then another. Finally, footsteps approached. A soft knock, the door opening. A doctor's voice, quiet but firm. "We have some news, Mrs. Blake. I'm very sorry." Silence. Then a slow, measured inhale. Elizabeth knew what was coming. She had expected this. There was a pause before she spoke, her voice breaking just enough to sound convincing. I see. Thank you, doctor. Can I see him?" A hesitation. The doctor was choosing his words carefully. "I think it's best to remember him as he was," he said. "The body will be transferred shortly. We will take care of everything for you." Jerome could picture it in his mind. The slight furrow in her brow as she weighed her options, the way she would hesitate just long enough to seem as though she was struggling with the decision. But she wouldn't push too hard. She had no reason to. He was gone. Her victory was complete. There was another pause, and then she exhaled. "You're right," she murmured. "That's probably for the best." A few more words, a few more pleasantries exchanged, and then the door closed. She was gone. Jerome let himself breathe. Amara returned not long after, her expression tense, her hands still trembling slightly as she shut the door behind her. "She didn't ask to see you," she whispered, as if even now she was afraid to break the illusion. She didn't even hesitate. Jerome wasn't surprised. Elizabeth had spent months preparing for this. She had spoken of his death as though it were inevitable, as though it were a waiting game rather than a tragedy. She had grown tired of the hospital, of the waiting, of the inconvenient ties that kept her from fully embracing her new life. Now she was free, or so she thought. Amara sat beside him, her fingers tracing the outline of his wrist as she whispered, "We're moving you tonight." The doctors had arranged everything. The official record would state that he had been transferred to another facility for post-mortem examination. But in reality, he would be taken somewhere safe, somewhere away from Elizabeth, away from the people who had already written him off. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a breath. "This is your chance." He met her gaze, his body still weak, his mind still exhausted, but he nodded. She smiled, her fingers squeezing his one last time before she stood. "Rest for now," she murmured. "Tomorrow we take everything back." And as she left the room, as the soft click of the door echoed through the silence, Jerome closed his eyes and let the weight of everything settle deep inside him. Elizabeth thought she had won, but she had no idea what was coming next. Elizabeth adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, letting the light catch on the delicate stones as she raised her champagne flute. The crystal clinked softly against the rim of another glass, a quiet symphony of indulgence echoing through the grand dining room. Around her, the soft hum of conversation flowed seamlessly, punctuated by laughter, the comfortable kind shared among people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. She had chosen the finest wine for the evening. A vintage bottle, aged just long enough to symbolize something more than mere luxury. It was a celebration, after all, a new chapter, a new beginning. The first night of a life unburdened by the past. A waiter moved beside her, discreetly refilling her glass before disappearing back into the shadows of the room. She barely acknowledged him. Her attention was elsewhere, focused on the man sitting across from her, the one who had so effortlessly slipped into the space Jerome had left behind. Thomas. His presence was easy, his smile just wide enough to be charming without appearing rehearsed. He was younger than Jerome, not by much, but enough to bring a certain energy that she had grown to crave. Where Jerome had been careful, precise in his words and actions, Thomas was effortless. He fit into her world without hesitation, without question. He raised his glass toward her in a silent toast, his eyes gleaming with something unspoken. "To new beginnings," he murmured. Elizabeth let her lips curve into a smile, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "To finally gettin' what we deserve." The words were spoken softly, but she knew he heard them. The way his smirk widened, the way his fingers brushed against hers on the table, told her everything she needed to know. They were in this together. She had been careful, of course. There was no reason to rush. Jerome's accounts had been frozen for the moment, a standard procedural delay, but she had no doubt that within a few weeks she would have access to everything. The lawyers were handling it, making sure the process was smooth. She had planned for this, had ensured that every piece of the puzzle fit exactly as it should, and so tonight she allowed herself to relax. The music played softly in the background, a jazz melody that lingered in the air like expensive perfume. The scent of fresh flowers, carefully arranged by the staff earlier that afternoon, filled the room. Everything was perfect. Until the doors opened. The shift in the air was subtle at first, a ripple that moved through the guests like a whisper before turning into a murmur. Elizabeth frowned, tilting her head slightly as she caught sight of the new arrival. It wasn't the staff. It wasn't a guest. It was him. For a moment, she didn't understand. Her mind refused to process what she was seeing. The man standing in the doorway, the one she had buried, the one whose death had secured her future, was alive. Jerome. A cold wave of something sharp and paralyzing rushed through her veins, freezing her in place. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the edges blurring as her grip tightened around the stem of her glass. This wasn't possible. She had been there. She had received the call. She had signed the papers. He was dead. And yet, here he was. His posture was different, more rigid, his shoulders squared with a quiet authority that sent something sharp and instinctual curling in the pit of her stomach. He was dressed simply. Dark slacks, a crisp white shirt rolled at the sleeves, but there was nothing casual about him. His eyes found hers instantly, locking onto her across the room with a quiet intensity that made her blood run cold. Elizabeth swallowed, forcing her breath to remain steady, her mind scrambling to regain control. This was a trick, a mistake. Something had gone wrong. But as he stepped forward, the steady weight of his movements sending a hush over the crowd, she knew. This was real. Jerome was alive. She forced herself to rise, ignoring the way her legs felt unsteady beneath her. The eyes of the guests were on them now, confusion and curiosity thick in the air. She took a step forward, then another, her lips parting slightly, as if she was about to speak, but no words came. Jerome didn't stop until he was only a few feet away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. And then his lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You seem surprised," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. Elizabeth's mind raced. There were too many variables, too many questions she had no answers for. How? How had this happened? She had made sure there was no hope. She had planned everything down to the last detail. But he was here, and he knew. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention, and she turned just in time to see Thomas rise from his chair, his expression unreadable. Jerome's gaze flicked to him briefly before returning to her. "You didn't waste any time," he observed. There was no accusation in his tone, only quiet amusement. That made it worse. Elizabeth's throat was dry. She stopped, realizing too late that she had no idea what to say. There was no script for this, no prepared response for a man who was supposed to be dead, standing in the middle of her carefully constructed life. The room was silent now, every guest watching, waiting. Jerome stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You should have made sure." And then, without another word, he turned. He didn't need to stay. He didn't need to say anything else, because he had already won. Elizabeth watched, helpless, as he walked away, the weight of his presence still thick in the air long after the doors closed behind him. The world around her felt suddenly unstable, shifting beneath her feet. She had spent so long waiting for this night, for the moment where she would finally be free. But now, standing in the center of her own victory, she realized something else entirely. She had never been more trapped. The silence in the dining hall lingered long after Jerome had disappeared through the double doors. It stretched, heavy and oppressive, swallowing the remnants of music and conversation that had once filled the grand space. The guests, still frozen in shock, exchanged glances, uncertain whether they had just witnessed reality or some carefully orchestrated spectacle. The air, once thick with the aroma of fine wine and delicate spices, now carried a different weight. Fear, unease, the slow unraveling of certainty. Elizabeth stood motionless, her grip tightening around the stem of her untouched champagne flute. Her mind raced, grasping for an explanation, an excuse, a way to control what had just happened. But there was none. The impossible had materialized in front of her, a nightmare she had buried clawing its way back to the surface. Jerome was alive. The thought settled in her chest like ice. Across the table, Thomas straightened, his expression unreadable. His hands rested on the polished wood, fingers drumming against the surface in slow, measured movements. Unlike the guests, who still reeled from the shock, he was studying her, waiting, calculating. She finally exhaled, setting her glass down with deliberate care. Every movement had to be controlled now, every word measured. There was still time to salvage this, to regain control. "He's lying," she murmured, just loud enough for Thomas to hear. "This is some kind of trick." Thomas arched an eyebrow. "A trick?" She turned to face him fully, forcing her body to remain still even as her mind screamed for action. "It's impossible. You saw the paperwork. You were there when I got the call. The hospital confirmed it." He studied her for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. And yet, he was standing right there. The words sent a fresh wave of unease through her, but she refused to show it. "We don't know what game he's playing," she said sharply, "but that's all it is, a game." Thomas said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence, of his slow, contemplative gaze, was answer enough. The room around them stirred to life once more. The guests, sensing the tension, began murmuring among themselves, some slipping away quietly, eager to distance themselves from whatever scandal was unfolding. Elizabeth forced herself to move, to glide through the space with a practiced grace, offering soft reassurances and feigned confusion to those who lingered, pretending to be just as blindsided as they were. By the time the last of them had left, the house had grown too quiet. The moment the doors shut behind the final guest, she turned back to Thomas. "We need to get ahead of this," she said. "Whatever story he's trying to spin, we need to control the narrative before it spreads." Thomas remained seated, his expression unreadable. "He's alive, Elizabeth." She clenched her jaw. "He's supposed to be dead," she corrected. He studied her carefully. "What did you do?" The words sent a sharp pulse of irritation through her, though she kept her features carefully composed. "I did nothing," she said, her voice clipped. "I followed the process." I trusted the doctors when they told me there was no hope. I made the decisions any loving wife would." Thomas tilted his head slightly, considering her. "And yet, here he is." A cold anger flared in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She needed to think. She needed to act. There was no room for doubt now, no time for hesitation. She turned away, crossing the room with measured steps. She needed answers. The hospital was quiet when she arrived, the late hour stripping it of its usual sterile bustle. The reception area was dimly lit, the soft hum of the overnight staff barely breaking the silence. She walked with purpose, each step echoing against the linoleum floor. The head physician, Dr. Whitaker, was waiting for her. His expression was drawn, wary, as if he had been expecting her. "Mrs. Blake," he greeted carefully. Elizabeth wasted no time. "Explain." He exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I was going to call you in the morning." "You should have called the moment he walked out of here alive," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the stillness. Dr. Whitaker hesitated, and for the first time, something uneasy flickered across his features. "There were complications," he admitted. "A miscommunication in the assessment of his condition. We believed—" "You believed wrong," she interrupted. "I signed the papers. I gave my consent. You assured me there was no hope." He flinched at her tone but held his ground. "Something changed," he said simply. Elizabeth's nails dug into her palm. That wasn't an answer. She took a slow breath, schooling her expression into something more composed. "Where is he now?" Dr. Whitaker hesitated. "I don't know." Her composure wavered. "You lost him?" He shook his head. "He was discharged." The words sent a cold pulse of realization through her. Discharged, not just alive, but well enough to leave. Her mind raced, calculating the implications. If he had simply woken up, disoriented and confused, it would have been one thing, but he had walked into her home. He had planned it. He knew. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a threat. She turned sharply, striding toward the exit without another word. There was no time to waste. The house was silent when she returned. She moved through the dimly lit hallways, her steps measured, her mind running through every possible scenario. Jerome hadn't just come back. He had made a statement. He had walked into her world, into the life she had so carefully constructed, and shattered the illusion with nothing more than his presence. But he hadn't stayed. That was what unsettled her the most. He had wanted her to see him, but he hadn't stayed to gloat. He had left without a fight, without anger. That meant he was planning something else. She needed to act before he did. She reached for her phone, dialing the only number that mattered now. It rang twice before Thomas picked up. "We have a problem," she said. His voice was calm. "We've had a problem since the moment he walked through that door." She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling sharply. "I need you to find him." A pause. "Why?" Her fingers tightened around the phone. "Because if he's alive, then everything is at risk." Another silence. Then, finally, "I'll take care of it." She exhaled slowly, lowering the phone from her ear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jerome stood at the edge of the hospital parking lot, the night air cool against his skin. The city stretched before him, glowing in the distance, pulsing with life that had once been his. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past weeks settle into his chest. He had been a ghost in his own life, a man trapped between existence and oblivion, but now he was back. He glanced down at his hands, flexing his fingers, feeling the renewed strength in them. They were still weak, still unsteady, but they were his again. His body was his again. No longer a prison, no longer a shell that others had written off. Amara stood beside him, silent but steady. She had been his anchor, the only one who had seen him when no one else had. She had risked everything to keep him alive, to give him a chance to reclaim what had been stolen from him. He turned to her now, studying her face in the dim glow of the streetlights. She looked tired, but her eyes held the same quiet determination he had come to rely on. "You should rest," he said softly. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "You should, too." He let out a breath, something close to a laugh. "I don't think I'll be able to." She nodded as if she understood. "What will you do now?" It was the question he had been asking himself since the moment he had opened his eyes. Since the moment he had heard Elizabeth plotting his death. Since the moment he had realized that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, had been reduced to nothing more than a waiting game for his demise. He could disappear. He had thought about it. Vanish into another life. Leave Elizabeth to choke on her own lies. Let her think she had won, even as the truth rotted away the foundation of everything she had built. But that wasn't enough, because she hadn't just tried to take his life. She had tried to erase him. And he wasn't done yet. "I'm going home," he said. Amara's smile faded slightly, her brows drawn together. "Are you sure that's safe?" He met her gaze. "I need her to see me." She hesitated, then nodded. "Then I'm coming with you." He didn't argue. He knew better by now. The drive back was quiet. The roads were mostly empty at this hour, the city winding down, unaware of the storm brewing beneath its surface. Jerome watched the skyline blur past the window, his hands tightening in his lap. When they finally pulled into the long, winding driveway of his home, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were seeing it for the first time. It was still the same. The manicured hedges, the grand entrance, the soft glow of lights spilling from the windows. Everything was exactly as he had left it. Except he was no longer welcome here. He stepped out of the car, feeling the gravel crunch beneath his feet. Amara followed closely behind, her presence a steady reminder that he was not alone in this. The front doors were unlocked. He had expected them to be. Elizabeth had never seen a reason to fear anything beyond her own carefully constructed world. The moment he stepped inside, the scent of expensive perfume and aged wood wrapped around him, familiar yet foreign. The house was quiet, but not empty. He could feel it, the weight of presence, the lingering energy of someone else moving through his space. And then, from the hallway, she appeared. Elizabeth froze at the sight of him, her face a mask of disbelief and something else. Something sharp and unspoken. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick, charged with everything left unsaid, everything that had been stolen. She recovered first. "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered. Jerome tilted his head slightly. "Disappointed?" Her expression flickered just for a moment, before she straightened her spine, schooling her features into something more composed. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Jerome, but—" He stepped forward, and she flinched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but he saw it. Fear. She had never been afraid of him before. He smiled. "I heard everything," he said. She stilled. "I heard you," he continued, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I heard you planning. I heard you waiting. I heard you making sure I wouldn't come back." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "I trusted you," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I built a life with you. and the moment I was weak, you tried to bury me." She took a slow step back, her eyes flicking toward the hallway, toward the escape she thought she might still have, but she didn't. Because this time, Jerome wasn't the one who had lost everything. He was, and he had nothing left to lose. "I could destroy you," he said, and she knew it wasn't a threat, it was a fact. Her mask cracked just slightly. "Jerome, He lifted a hand, stopping her. "I don't want to hear it." Her mouth snapped shut. For the first time since he had woken up, he felt truly in control. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, "effective immediately. You get nothing." She blinked. "That's not—" "It is." Her breath hitched. "You can't just—" "I can." She took another step back. "You wouldn't." He tilted his head slightly. "Wouldn't I?" She had no answer for that because she knew. She had lost. Jerome exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Get out." Elizabeth opened her mouth as if to argue, but then she saw it, the finality in his gaze. He wasn't asking. He wasn't warning. He was done. And so, for the first time in their marriage, she had no choice but to listen. She turned, her movements stiff, her face unreadable. She walked past him, her steps quick but controlled, and disappeared down the hallway. A few moments later, the front door clicked shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. Jerome let out a slow breath, the weight of everything pressing into his chest. He turned, meeting Amara's gaze. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He had won, but more importantly, he had survived. And now, for the first time in a long time, he was finally free. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next videos. Share this video with your friends and let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more, check out our other videos. There's plenty more to explore.